Imagine stepping onto a deeply historic stage, staring directly into the highly critical eyes of the most legendary, fiercely intimidating theatrical veterans in the entire world, and knowing they completely expect you to fail. For decades, the elite titans of London's West End have ruthlessly guarded their prestigious territory, fiercely rejecting reality television stars as highly manufactured, deeply disposable novelties. But when Matty Juniosa aggressively unleashed his massive, completely undeniable vocal power inside the legendary London Palladium, he did not just silence his vicious critics, he completely paralyzed them. This is the breathtaking, deeply profound, untold story of the exact night a heavily doubted Filipino reality star violently forced the absolute greatest musical legends on the planet to their feet. This is how Matty Juniosa left the West End completely speechless. The massive, deeply historic theater district of London is heavily controlled by an incredibly elite, notoriously vicious syndicate of highly traditional theatrical veterans. For over a century, these deeply cynical industry titans have meticulously served as the absolute ultimate gatekeepers of global entertainment, fiercely protecting the massive prestige of the West End from any perceived outside infiltration. They possess an incredibly deep, highly ingrained prejudice against anyone who rapidly achieves massive global fame through the heavily manufactured, deeply superficial channels of modern reality television. In their highly conservative, deeply traditional minds, a true, legitimate performing artist absolutely must endure decades of grueling classical training and brutal stage experience before ever daring to claim a highly coveted spot in their elite theatrical sanctuary. When the massive, highly unprecedented news officially broke that Matty Juniosa, a massive viral sensation fresh off a completely historic double golden buzzer run on Britain's Got Talent, was heavily scheduled to headline the iconic London Palladium, the collective industry outrage was absolutely deafening. The highly powerful, deeply seasoned West End legends completely viewed his massive booking as a deeply insulting, highly offensive corporate cash grab, aggressively preparing to completely tear his deeply ambitious theatrical debut entirely to shreds the absolute second he dared to open his mouth. They were absolutely convinced that his massive television hype was completely entirely fabricated by clever audio editing, completely lacking the sheer, raw vocal stamina required to successfully survive a highly demanding, full-length live theatrical production. The immense, absolutely suffocating psychological pressure resting heavily upon Matty's incredibly fragile shoulders leading up to his massive premiere night was completely, utterly paralyzing. He was highly acutely aware that the absolute most vicious, deeply influential theater critics and highly celebrated, legendary West End performers had specifically secured the absolute front row seats for the sole, incredibly cynical purpose of actively witnessing his massive public downfall. These were the incredibly intimidating, highly powerful individuals who had actively built massive global empires through sheer theatrical perfection, and they were completely, entirely ready to aggressively expose him as a highly manufactured, deeply disposable television fraud. The highly toxic, deeply hostile industry narrative aggressively dictated that he would quickly crumble under the massive, terrifying weight of the historic Palladium stage. Instead of safely hiding behind a massive, highly distracting corporate stage production, or relying heavily on incredibly loud backing tracks to safely mask any potential vocal imperfections, he bravely made the incredibly dangerous, highly terrifying creative decision to completely strip everything away. He actively chose to aggressively confront the massive, highly skeptical wall of legendary theatrical titans, armed absolutely entirely with nothing but the sheer, completely naked, deeply vulnerable truth of his incredibly massive, undeniably powerful vocal instrument. He was actively preparing to completely risk his entire newly acquired global empire on a single, highly dangerous, fiercely independent vocal performance, that would either completely permanently legitimize his professional career or aggressively destroy it in front of the entire world. When the incredibly heavy, deeply iconic velvet curtains of the massive London Palladium finally aggressively separated, the entire atmosphere inside the highly historic auditorium was incredibly thick with absolute, terrifyingly cold tension. The highly seasoned, deeply legendary theatrical veterans sat entirely motionless in the absolute front rows, their arms heavily crossed, their incredibly critical eyes violently piercing completely through the massive darkness of the auditorium. As Matty bravely stepped entirely alone into the incredibly harsh, blindingly bright singular spotlight, the massive, highly intimidating silence of the incredibly cynical crowd felt like a heavily suffocating physical weight pressing violently against his chest. He was completely entirely stripped of his deeply comforting television editing, completely fully exposed to the absolute most highly critical, deeply unforgiving entertainment audience on the entire planet. But the absolute specific microsecond, he forcefully gripped the microphone and completely unleashed the very first, incredibly powerful, deeply resonant note of his massive opening vocal number. A completely massive, entirely unprecedented seismic shift violently, completely rocked the deeply historic venue. The incredibly heavy, highly manufactured atmosphere of deeply cynical expectation instantly violently evaporated, completely aggressively replaced by an absolute, stunning, deeply profound sense of complete, undeniable vocal shock. The highly seasoned theatrical veterans were instantly violently forced to completely sit up straight, their heavily crossed arms rapidly falling completely to their sides as they actively helplessly realized they were actively witnessing a completely undeniable, massive vocal anomaly. What completely paralyzed the highly seasoned West End legends was not merely the incredibly massive, undeniable physical volume of his highly powerful voice, but the absolutely breathtaking, deeply profound technical mastery he effortlessly displayed. Reality television deeply conditions the massive global audience to highly expect incredibly loud, heavily strained vocal acrobatics that entirely lack any genuine, deep emotional nuance or true artistic sophistication. However, Matty brilliantly delivered an incredibly complex, highly sophisticated vocal masterclass that completely rivaled the absolute greatest, most deeply trained classical opera singers in the entire world. He flawlessly navigated incredibly massive, heavily terrifying vocal jumps, brilliantly transitioning from a deeply raspy, highly aggressive rock belt directly into a completely fragile, deeply angelic falsetto, without ever losing an absolute single ounce of his massive vocal control. The incredibly demanding theatrical titans, who actively famously pride themselves on instantly spotting even the absolute slightest, heavily microscopic vocal flaw, were completely entirely unable to actively find a single, solitary technical weakness in his massive, completely undeniable performance. He was aggressively, systematically destroying every single highly prejudiced, deeply conservative expectation they had heavily formed against him, actively forcing the massive room to completely deeply acknowledge his absolute, undeniably terrifying level of sheer, raw vocal perfection and absolute artistic maturity. Beyond the incredibly breathtaking, highly technical vocal precision, the absolute true, undeniable magic of his massive historic performance aggressively stemmed from the incredibly raw, deeply terrifying emotional vulnerability heavily injected into every single lyrical phrase. The highly seasoned West End veterans are deeply accustomed to actively watching highly trained actors brilliantly, flawlessly simulate deep emotional pain on a massive stage. But Matty was not actively acting. He was completely aggressively bleeding his entire deeply agonizing history of intense national rejection, severe childhood bullying, and massive psychological trauma directly onto the highly historic floorboards. Every single incredibly massive, soaring high note completely functioned as a desperate, deeply urgent, heavily raw, completely unfiltered plea for radical human empathy and absolute unconditional acceptance. He completely aggressively forced the highly cynical, heavily guarded theatrical titans to actively look directly into the deeply shattered soul of a completely misunderstood outcast. The incredibly heavy, deeply palpable wave of raw human emotion completely aggressively flooded the massive auditorium, violently piercing directly through the highly thick, heavily armored, deeply protected hearts of the absolute, most notoriously cold, highly vicious industry executives in the entire building, actively forcing them to completely, deeply, genuinely feel every single ounce of his massive past trauma. As the incredibly massive, highly emotional theatrical production steadily, forcefully built toward its absolute, highly terrifying climax, a deeply profound, completely unprecedented physical reaction began to actively, organically spread directly throughout the absolute front rows of the massive historic venue. The incredibly powerful, deeply legendary theatrical titans, individuals who had completely spent their entire highly decorated lives aggressively judging and heavily criticizing the absolute greatest, most celebrated global voices, were actively, completely, physically overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated force of his massive vocal power. Several highly influential, heavily famous veteran actors and deeply respected musical directors were actively, completely, visibly weeping, their heavily guarded, deeply cynical professional exteriors entirely violently shattered by the absolute, undeniable, deeply raw authenticity of his massive delivery. They actively, entirely realized in that incredibly, deeply specific, highly monumental moment that they were absolutely not just deeply actively watching a highly successful, completely manufactured reality television star. They were actively bearing witness to the incredibly highly explosive genesis of a completely once in a deeply massive generation theatrical legend, a highly undeniable vocal force of absolute complete nature that completely transcends the highly restrictive, heavily manufactured boundaries of the traditional commercial entertainment industry. They were entirely mesmerized by his absolute greatness. The incredibly historic, deeply profound final vocal crescendo of his massive live performance remains one of the absolute most powerful, completely unforgettable moments in the entire rich history of the legendary London Palladium. As the highly dramatic, deeply emotional production steadily reached its absolute breaking point, Matty prepared to deliver a highly complex, incredibly demanding vocal run that heavily terrifies even the most seasoned classical singers. When he aggressively unleashed the absolute, incredibly terrifying final note of his deeply dramatic closing anthem, he entirely suspended absolute time within the massive, highly historic auditorium. The incredibly massive, deeply resonant vocal belt completely effortlessly soared high above the heavily amplified, massive live orchestra, violently shaking the absolute physical foundations of the deeply historic theatrical cathedral. It was an incredibly undeniable, deeply raw display of absolute vocal supremacy that aggressively, violently demanded absolute, unconditional industry respect from every single highly cynical executive in the massive room. As the highly massive, deeply heavy final chord finally slowly echoed into an absolute, deeply profound, stunned silence, the entire incredibly massive, completely packed auditorium completely froze. They were actively paralyzed by the absolute, terrifying magnitude of the deeply historic vocal masterclass they had just actively witnessed. He had completely, successfully, and permanently silenced the absolute loudest, most notoriously vicious theater critics on the entire planet, completely replacing their highly toxic, heavily prejudiced industry doubts with an absolute, deeply profound sense of complete, undeniable theatrical awe. The deeply profound, incredibly massive, completely stunned silence that heavily followed the final soaring note lasted for what entirely felt like an absolute, highly terrifying eternity before the entire historic venue completely violently erupted. The incredibly feared, absolutely legendary West End theatrical titans, who had initially sat with their arms heavily crossed in deep, cynical expectation, completely violently leaped directly to their feet. They actively led an incredibly massive, deeply historic, completely deafening 10-minute standing ovation that completely shattered the deeply traditional, highly conservative decorum of the elite British theatre community. These highly powerful, heavily guarded industry veterans, who actively pride themselves on deeply withholding their absolute elite approval, were actively screaming, loudly cheering, and completely openly weeping in absolute, undeniable professional respect. They were entirely forced to absolutely publicly concede that the deeply rejected Filipino reality television contestant had completely beaten them entirely at their very own highly elite, deeply complex theatrical game. It was an absolute, completely undeniable physical manifestation of total, unconditional industry surrender. The incredibly massive, heavily prejudiced walls of the deeply traditional West End establishment completely violently crumbled under the sheer, absolute, unadulterated force of his deeply raw, fiercely unapologetic vocal authenticity, permanently establishing his massive name among the absolute greatest, most legendary performing artists in history. The incredibly emotional, deeply chaotic aftermath directly backstage, following the massive, historic premiere, was entirely filled with incredibly unprecedented, completely massive industry interactions that completely defied all traditional theatrical protocol. The highly powerful, heavily legendary theatrical veterans actively bypassed the incredibly strict, heavily guarded security checkpoints, specifically to deeply personally congratulate him directly inside his massive dressing room. Highly famous, deeply celebrated theatrical directors and absolutely legendary, incredibly intimidating musical composers actively approached the young artist with absolute, profound tears directly in their eyes. They entirely explicitly apologized for actively ever doubting his absolute, massive vocal capabilities, actively acknowledging him completely as a deeply undeniable, absolute equal within the highly exclusive, heavily elite global theatrical community. The deeply absolute, totally undeniable respect he completely commanded in those incredibly private, highly monumental backstage moments entirely solidified his absolute, massive global industry status. He was no longer actively viewed as a highly manufactured, deeply disposable reality television novelty actor desperately begging for a tiny sliver of mainstream attention. He was actively, deeply revered as a completely undeniable, highly terrifying vocal powerhouse who had completely successfully forcefully conquered the absolute most difficult, highly critical theatrical mountain on the entire planet. The massive titans of the global stage actively bowed to his undeniable, fierce greatness. By completely aggressively shattering the incredibly heavily guarded, highly elitist expectations of the absolute, most deeply critical theatrical audience on the entire planet, Matty Juniosa successfully revolutionized his absolute entire massive global legacy. He entirely completely destroyed the deeply toxic, incredibly restrictive reality television curse, actively proving that a deeply fierce, completely authentic, openly queer Filipino artist can absolutely dominate the highly prestigious, heavily historic stages in the entire world, entirely on his own uncompromising terms. He did not simply merely survive the highly vicious, completely terrifying West End theatrical gauntlet. He completely aggressively redefined exactly what it absolutely truly means to be a highly undeniable, massive global vocal titan. The absolutely undeniable, deeply profound truth is that he completely left the absolute most legendary, highly celebrated vocalists in the entire world completely, absolutely speechless. His incredibly historic, deeply massive London Palladium triumph completely actively guarantees that his deeply unique, fiercely unapologetic artistic voice will absolutely permanently echo throughout the highly historic, deeply guarded halls of the traditional theatrical establishment for completely countless generations to come. forever cementing his absolute, deeply undeniable status as a true, massive, highly unstoppable international music empire. He successfully proved to every single deeply marginalized outcast across the entire globe that the exact same fierce authenticity that once caused immense rejection will ultimately become the exact specific weapon used to conquer the world.